Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Medicine podcast, where science, policy, and innovation meet. As always, I'm your host, John Stanford. This week, we're back with the top stories from this busy week and a new edition of our Press Pass segment, where we'll be talking with Max Bayer, one of the top pharma policy reporters at Endpoints News, and frankly, one of the top pharma policy reporters anywhere. And with that, let's get into the show. Before we get into this week's Press Pass episode with Max Bayer from Endpoints News, we'll share a few headlines. Most notably was the White House event on autism featuring HHS Secretary RFK Jr. that mainly pointed to the use of Tylenol by pregnant women, as well as vaccines as a leading cause of autism. The administration also announced that the FDA will push Tylenol for labeling changes, as well as the possible approval of an existing cancer drug to treat cerebral folate deficiency, or CFD, a neurological condition associated with autism. Notably, neither of those changes, the Tylenol labeling or the approval of the cancer medicine, will have gone through the traditional regulatory pathways. Effectively, all major medical societies, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Academy of Family Physicians, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, as well as a number of patient groups, immediately responded debunking some of the claims of the White House's announcement. Also in the news, via President Trump, is the idea of changing SEC filings from quarterly to twice a year. Proponents for the change suggest that the decreased regulatory burden of having to report will allow companies to focus on R&D, put resources to better use, and not chase short-term growth. Specifically for biotech companies, this may slightly change some of the calculations around IPOs. Opponents to the change suggest it removes transparency and removes opportunities to understand what's going on at the companies. Either way, for a challenging IPO environment for biotech, this is an idea that will have a lot more conversation. Max, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, John. Great to be here.
Well, I think, we catch up pretty regularly, but it was great to see you around at Bio, other conferences. It's hard to turn your head in this space and not see you doing some of the great reporting. And there's been a lot to report on, as we'll get into. So my first question, I think, is, what is the top thing that's standing out to you over the last couple months or where we're going?
It is difficult to create a hierarchy, honestly, even in the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I think, in short, it would be sort of the totality of actions against drug makers from the administration and really, obviously, sort of from the White House, not Congress or elsewhere. I think MFN, sort of a looming deadline for more action there is sort of top of mind. How that relates to tariffs, those seem to be sort of running in parallel. And then, as we've discussed, I think potential executive action on the out-licensing business from China for new innovative medicines. That's, maybe number 3 on my list. And that's on top of things involving vaccines and other actions happening at some of the health agencies. So it's been busy.
You have been busy. And for those of you who don't tune into Max's articles, you are absolutely missing out. So make sure that you do, because he usually has quite a lot of scoops. And like you said, I like your phrasing there. It's the totality of the circumstances. Now, you spend a lot of time covering both the biotechs and the manufacturers. A lot of, like you said, the totality of those threats, the uncertainty, the just sheer overwhelming amount of things that the manufacturers have had to navigate. How do you see that playing into sort of our lane of the investment space and biotechs and entrepreneurs? Do you feel uncertainty there? Do you feel uncomfortable? Or do they kind of push those off and say those are manufacturing issues?
It's product specific is the short answer. I think and we can sort of touch on this a little bit, vaccines as a product right now. I think the Washington Post had a good story about the impact for maybe some of the smaller startups. That's been more difficult to invest in the new administration. But then you also have sort of maybe smaller biotechs working in a rare disease space, like the stealth biotherapeutics of the world or the Replimune that have faced surprises from the FDA, recognizing, of course, that stealth just recently got approved. but Replimune is still in a standstill situation, and I think those things make investing in biotech a little harder. I think if you ask regular or investors rather, if you ask them what they need more than anything, it's regulatory continuity. And I feel like in the first few months of the administration, they felt like that's been lacking in a way, especially for companies working on rare disease drugs, because sometimes the admin will say one thing, the regulatory actions will be another. Still, I think people would say that like there's still cool new medicines that are being developed. You still have the GLP-1 space. You have Metsera's multi-billion-dollar acquisition by Pfizer yesterday. So certainly there are opportunities for investors from both like a standpoint of making money on their return and also the opportunity for new medicines to be approved.
You mentioned in your totality listing, I'm going to keep coming back to that, one of them
Yeah, please.
being MFN. We've had an episode about MFN. I think not only is the threat real, but we're starting to see behavioral shifts from some of these companies. BMS was out with the announcement about charging the same price in the UK. What do you make of that? Do you think, if the administration's theory is we're going to pay less here by making others pay their fair share, how are you seeing in real time companies reacting to that?
They're taking the threat very seriously, first and foremost. I think that in a general discussion of, well, you have two options, you can lower your prices here or you can raise them somewhere else. I don't think it's that surprising that the first tact by companies is let's actually do that other route. The harder part still is like what are prices going to come, I mean, right, because they still are going to have to come down in the US in some form for some number of drugs, for some corner of a company's portfolio. The president has made it clear he'd like to see drug prices come down. What that looks like, I think, is still up in the air, and we'll get to that in a second. But I think with respect to Europe and the UK, that's almost in a way like easy pickings. Like if you look at the UK, for example, and I was talking to a colleague about this, there's been friction there for years. And I would point people to sort of discussions between AstraZeneca and NICE in the UK on Enhertu, which is their breast cancer treatment. They have been at odds over the price of that drug. And I would just sort of tell people that to me has sort of been a bit of a canary of what we're now seeing, which is when faced with whether you call it pressure, whether you call it just sort of like a wink, wink, nod, nod, you should invest more money in the US with all of these other sort of overhangs. Like companies are choosing to move money into the US. That means it has to come, from potential other investments that they were set to have in Europe or the UK or elsewhere. And there are other regulatory elements to the UK that I think the pharmaceutical industry has taken issue with, specifically on pricing, that predate MFN. And so it's in a way like an easy out. They can use the leverage that the Trump administration is putting on them and flip it to the UK and say, look, like our hands are a little bit tied here. You've been pissing us off for a couple of years. We're not going to play ball, right? They have sort of the leverage the US is putting on pharma manufacturers, they can put onto the UK, and it makes a little bit of sense, is sort of how I would put it.
Yeah, and we're only a couple days away from the end of the month where, in theory, action's supposed to have been taken. What do you think that looks like, and what do you think success is for the White House here? What do you think has to happen that this announcement, is important to them and shows progress towards the goals that they've been making? And, are we going to point to BMS and the UK activity as saying this is exactly what President Trump wanted?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I've gone back and forth with a colleague of mine, Drew, our executive editor, who's done a lot of sort of good reporting on the sidelines on MFN, and I've tried to lend a hand when possible. But I think success for the administration will be. I'll be actually sort of specific here. I think if they can get a lower GLP-1 price than we've seen Lilly or Novo advertise on their own, that would be probably pretty big. Why is that? Because that is probably the number one medicine right now that patients would be willing to pay out of pocket for. And because there have been sort of insurance gaps in a way, I think insurance has been picking up a little bit if I'm just sort of seeing anecdotes and compiling them. The problem, though, is like, outside of that drug class, I'm trying to think of drugs that like if they're more than 700, $800 out of pocket that patients would even use. So the administration, I think, just is probably considering and has to be cognizant of, we don't want to have a DTC platform out where we're offering drugs from a number of different pharmas at these reduced prices, but that they're at still such a high out of pocket level that that patients aren't paying for them. And then there's inevitably a headline a couple months from now that's like, no traffic to Trump RX, right? I'm just sort of making that up based off of
Yeah.
sort of Bloomberg's reporting about potential branding. But like would be a concern. Like if no one is using this thing, then it's going to backfire and it's not going to sort of have the health policy momentum that I think the administration wants it to. So, I think like at some point you have to imagine that insurers are going to be included in this conversation. Um, they would need to be if uptake and actual access to reduced prices are going to be um, used and tapped into by patients and employers. Um, I think that's sort of the main thing. And so if they don't bring insurers in, then I think it's really going to have to center on some reduction in price of a major product that patients will pay out of pocket for. The only one I can really think of right now is the GLP-1s.
Yeah, I think I think that's as sound of a case as any. I'm still letting the wheels turn on Trump RX
Yeah.
and seeing that somewhere. I think you've laid out the best case of what that success looks like. And like you said, GLP-1s do seem to be this unique class where patients, real life, out of pocket all seem to mix. I think one of the troubles for the Democrats with the IRA, and besides a number of bad policies being in it, was also just not feeling, wait, something changed here that is benefiting me. And because of sort of the architecture of our healthcare system, very few of these levers actually really make a meaningful difference. And in exchange, we sacrifice some innovation, some biopharmaceutical leadership, which is where I want to go next. Let's go all the way around the world to, you have been one of the closest to the ground out of all the reporters I talked to, absolutely one of the closest on developments out of China and how it's becoming not a bright line, but definitely different perspectives from the early stage, from investors, from the large pharma. I'm curious, what are some of the takeaways your reporting has led you to see on China? Are they catching up, surpassing, moving faster than we all expected? And will China continue to play, in your view, just a dominant role in the next couple of years? Threw a lot of questions at you.
Oh yeah, very, very dominant, only getting more dominant in select therapeutic areas. But I think like from my vantage point, the rate at which they are investing in Cambridge-like ecosystems across, I think that's people who actually have gone to China, whether that's investors or manufacturers. It almost feels like just in the last year. And then if you're just looking at the last 2 years, like what the conversation has been like, it's kind of astounding the pace at which, again, they're creating these Cambridge-like ecosystems where there's a university, there's R&D hubs, there's biotechs that are situated in these like, whether that's Cambridge or maybe even a better example would be like the Texas Medical Center, like with MD Anderson. Like
Yeah.
I think people really need to grasp like multiplying the Texas Medical Center by like a dozen across the United States. And so if you do that math, I think you have a lot of scientists who are sort of recognizing this is a massive new ecosystem, a new economy for them that just in the last 3, 4, 5 years has ballooned. And recognize too that the reason why the out licensing business became so hot is because domestic venture capital wasn't really flowing in. So the main exit for Chinese-based investors or Asia-based investors and the companies was, let's find Western partners for these. And that business model has just been scorching hot. So I think that's going to continue. I think you have some of the largest manufacturers that have now sourced a lot of medicine from there at a much cheaper valuation than they maybe would
Yeah.
have had from a U.S. Counterpart. That's just, like I think we can sort of what the solution is to fix that is, I think now what the administration is maybe wising up to a little bit, whether that's actual restrictions on licensing deals, or whether that's creating a US ecosystem that's more competitive so that we ourselves have 12 Texas medical centers around the country. Like, I think that's what's up for debate. But what is like what if the US started to restrict licensing deals, then it would just be Europe's gain, and I think we would see shortly thereafter that the US biotech ecosystem and venture capital flowing into Europe would increase significantly. Um, but it is like it's hard to track how quickly this story has changed, because at one point it was like, wow, this is like going pretty fast, and the next thing it's like, wow, now like we're starting to see all of these deals have some sort of China element to them. And then it's like, wow, actually, China is now almost the leader. I think there was some data point recently that was like they've actually sort of led on new molecules or something, or like trial start paces out of China are incredible. Like across the board, when you're looking at statistics that measure new innovative R&D, how fast that science is going in being tested into patients, it's been rapid. And large drug makers are paying attention and paying good money for some of those drugs.
Yeah, and it seems like, you and I had a chance to briefly talk about the New York Times article that came out, and this idea of an EO that could be out there and all these China actions. I guess I'm not as much of a China expert as you are. It just sort of seems like the surge we're seeing in China, it's like akin to AI and crypto. It wasn't there a couple years ago, and then boom, it is here. It is almost unstoppable. And so some of the ideas being kicked around just seem like, hey, we're just going to throw up a wall. But I take your point well of like, okay, well, we can throw up a wall, but Europe, who's been itching to get back in this game for the last 4 decades, like this is just kind of handing it on a silver platter. And then we had Kendall from Mass Bio on a couple weeks ago, and she did a good job putting it all together of the pieces of a dampening US ecosystem, MFN, tariffs, NIH, SBIR, all of it just adding up to, we're not given a great green light for biotech here. And then we've got this dominant force, and both of them are just going to stretch our leadership so thin that possibly at some point it breaks. What do you make of that?
Well, I think she's spot on, and she's a great person to address this because she represents the mass bio ecosystem. I mean, she's in a leadership role of one of those, like biotech hubs that we have here. And I think the headlines out of Boston and Massachusetts in the last year haven't been great. I think it was the first time in years that there's actually been a net loss of biotech jobs. And I've been reporting on layoffs in the biotech ecosystem, and that sort of checks out from our vantage point. But yeah, it's the sum. I mean, keep in mind what else wasn't mentioned there. Granted, this hasn't been reflected in like an actual EO, but I think Howard Lutnick referenced recently wanting to tap in to university patents, before they even come to bear. And I think just the threat of march-in rights from the Biden administration had people like pulling their hair out. So if we were to package this, it would be that sort of in the snap of a finger through budget cuts and the current ecosystem for new science, new investment in science, motivating new scientists, H-1B visas, which are critical to labs in some way. And I don't want to weigh in on sort of whether one political action is right or wrong, so much as to say that I think when you package it all together, it definitely pours cold water on the ecosystem. A economic adversary is doing the exact opposite. And what have we learned from China over a number of years now? When they decide to pour resources into something and make something a national priority, it is a light switch. They are going to rapidly grow it. If you look at infrastructure or clean energy, it has been the same over the years. So the idea that the only option now, and I don't think people who have sort of advocated for restrictions on China deals would say that that's the only thing we have to do to give them credit, to be clear. But I think that we as a nation are not an EO away from bolstering the US biotech ecosystem if we put limits on China. And then you would have people who also, if they were just speaking ethically, not even economically, would tell you who are we to restrict US patients' access to potentially better drugs, regardless of where they come from. I mean, that's for many people, that's sort of their core argument. Even if you set before them like a strong economic reason to restrict it. Like I think people would still say, it would sort of give them caution and pause.
I think that last point is such a great one, because bringing it back to the patients when you're talking about investment and economics, at the end of the day, we have gotten so used to the innovation coming out of our labs, our companies. The idea that there's innovation that we couldn't have access to is actually so foreign. And do we have affordability and access issues in the US? Absolutely. But we don't know what it's like to know, just over there is the thing that could make you better or make a loved one better. And I was on this panel with some of the universities, and one of them threw out this line that's just stuck in my head. What happens when she picked diabetes and just sort of said, well, what happens when China's advancements have the cure for diabetes, something that we need desperately in this country, or the cure for some cancer that we need desperately in this country, and they begin to play a geopolitical game of access and pricing. And we almost can't think about that as Americans. We've never had that experience that Japan has had, that the EU has, that the UK has of, we know there's good stuff out there, but unfortunately that door is not open to us because we don't really want to value it. So I'm glad you called that one out, because at the end of the day, if China's inventing great new medicines, we should make sure those great new medicines do find their way to American patients.
Right, exactly. And it just, again, I think thinking, it also is just, how are we thinking long-term about this in a moment where I think the industry, the national US-based industry is in a bit of like a shell shock state about what to even advocate or lobby for, with a number of different policies or executive actions that seem to dampen support or dampen potential pricing. It's definitely, I think, thrown people in a little bit of like a state of disarray of just like, what is, you asked at the very top of this call, what to me was like the story of the day. I would hate to be the person who's like having to answer that question to a boardroom, of like, it's like, it's easy for you and I to banter and be like, oh, what are you paying attention to? It's like, well, a lot, but you're the CEO of like a major company or even a top biotech, and you have to sort of think about where you're putting resources in your advocacy work or your lobbying or your R&D, your business development. And those are harder questions to answer. And I think for US-based companies, those have gotten harder in the last 7-8 months.
I think that's a great place to leave it. I will shamelessly plug, they are happening more in the boardrooms, which means we are now seeing them more in their filings, and Incubate tracks regulatory filings and SEC filings through our new MFN tracker, our rare disease tracker, and our IRA investment tracker. And I mean, the uptick is just over and over again. Now companies say, the idea that they're writing MFN into their risks corridor in their SEC filings,
right.
It's crazy, but we are so grateful. You've been generous with your time. You've been even more generous with your reporting. And I can't stress enough how critical your work is to informing us of keeping up what's going on out there. And so hopefully we'll have you back on. We'll find out if your prediction about the Trump announcement next week is right. And we just look forward to having you back on for another Press Pass.
Well, John, this was a pleasure. Thank you for having me on. If anyone hears anything that I should know about, you know where to find me.
Yeah, we'll put his Signal, his Telegram, his DMs, all of it. We'll put them in the link to the episode because if you have a tip, there's no better place to take it than Max. So
there you go.
Thanks as always. Thanks for the great work of Endpoints, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, sir.
That's all for this week's episode of the Making Medicine podcast. Have a thought or a question about today's topics? Drop a comment and we'll feature it in next week's episode. A special thank you to Max Bayer and Endpoint News for joining this week's segment of Press Pass. And don't forget to subscribe to YouTube and follow us on LinkedIn, X, and Instagram using the links in the description. You can also find Max's information if you've got a hot tip. Thanks for listening, and as always, keep innovating.